Hello, and welcome to today's Ask the Experts webinar, State of Play, the ins and outs of healthy and problematic video gaming. I am Kris Perry, Executive Director of Children and Screens, Institute of Digital Media and Child Development. One of the most common questions we hear from our audience is whether video games are good or bad for kids. This is an incredibly difficult question to answer, but we have brought together a fantastic expert panel to do so. With a slightly different format from our usual events, today's panelists are going to briefly review some of the latest science on the nuanced dimensions of video game play and outcomes for youth, and then together they will discuss how you can apply these considerations to healthy gameplay. Without further ado, let's meet today's moderator. Dr. Doug Gentile is an award-winning research scientist, educator, author, and distinguished professor of psychology at Iowa State University, where he leads the Media Research Lab. He is the author and editor of many books and over 150 peer-reviewed scientific papers, including studies on the positive and negative effects of mass media on children in several countries, video game addiction, and mindfulness practices for reducing anxiety and increasing happiness. He was honored with the Distinguished Lifetime Contributions Award to Media Psychology and Technology by the American Psychological Association, and he was named one of the top 300 professors in the United States by the Princeton Review. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to set the stage for our panelists by talking about one way we could think about this question of, are video games good or bad? This is a question I get a lot, and I always think it's the wrong question. And so much of my early research looked at things like violent games and aggression and on video game addiction. So those sound bad, right? But then I also have studies on pro-social games increasing pro-social behaviors, or on laparoscopic surgeons who play games being better at advanced surgical skills. So those sound good. And as I looked at the full literature, it became clear to me that these aren't the same type of effect. And there are at least 5 dimensions on which video games can have important psychological effects. So I'd like to list these 5, and our panelists will certainly reference some of them and perhaps add to them as we go on this afternoon. The first is amount, just how much time kids are in front of the screen, how much time they're spending with video games. And amount seems to be most related to things like school performance. The more time they're spending on games, they're not doing homework, and their school performance does seem to suffer. It seems to be related to some physical health outcomes, such as risk for obesity and video-induced seizures, as well as perhaps addiction. But it doesn't seem to be related to things like aggressive behavior or pro-social behavior. When we look at the content of the games, and this is the second dimension, that seems to be very much related to certain specific behavioral outcomes. So aggressive games do predict more aggressive thoughts, feelings, and perhaps behaviors. Pro-social games predict increased empathy and increased helpful and cooperative behaviors. If you're doing educational games, Reader Rabbit does improve reading skills. Math Blaster does improve math skills. So those are the 2 main things that most people think about when they think about all of the research on this, but there are at least 3 more dimensions. The third one is what we could call structure. How things are actually structured on the screen changes their psychological impact. I'll give you an example from TV and film literature. If you see a man and a woman go into a bedroom and close the door and there's a fade to black, we take away a very specific meaning of what we think happened behind that door. But if you see the same man and woman go into the same room and close the door and it cuts to the next scene, we don't take away the same meaning of what we think happened. So how it's structured, a fade edit or a cut edit, it actually changes its psychological impact. Similarly, when you're playing, say, a violent game, you're practicing paying attention to the whole screen all at once and noticing tiny little changes of movement all around it. And there's a lot of good research showing that when you play those types of games, you actually get better at widening your useful field of view, noticing smaller and smaller changes. The fourth effect is the context. We could mean this both the in-game context and the out-of-game context. So if you're playing a massively multiplayer online game all by yourself, there are just certain parts of the game you'll never get to see because you need to have a team to be able to go into them. So whether you're playing alone or with friends can change the content that you're allowed to see, can change what types of experiences you can have in that game. Similarly, if you're playing sitting with your friends or your family, that can enhance some of the effects. So for example, if you're playing violent games and your friends are all cheering you on for being violent, that could enhance the aggression effect. It also possibly could mitigate it, because perhaps you go into it with a different motivation, to a more pro-social motivation to help your team. So the context might totally change the psychological effect. This is an unanswered question, by the way, in the literature. So for those of you looking for a dissertation project, there's a good one for you. And the fifth dimension is the mechanics. As you're using the controller, you learn how to use the controller. You learn how to use the keyboard or the mouse or Xbox controller, and how to navigate the spaces. So in fact, although we're talking about these 5 dimensions as theoretically distinct, and I believe they aren't easy to separate in the real world, because as you move your thumbs on the controller, what you see changes. So the structure on the screen changes. As the screen changes, you change what you're doing with your thumbs. This feedback loop between the mechanical and the structural side of things is what we talk about as hand-eye coordination. So the question of, are games good or bad? Well, it kind of depends which of these 5 you care about. If your kid is spending a lot of time playing Grand Theft Auto, the lot of time probably means poor school performance. The violent content probably means increased aggressive thoughts and feelings and possibly behaviors. Because it's both a driving game and a shooting game, their mouse and keyboard targeting skills should improve, as should their ability to gather information off of the full screen. If they're playing with friends, that might enhance or mitigate the aggression effect. And if they're playing on a mouse and keyboard, their mouse and keyboard skills improve. So is it good or bad? Well, it depends which of those 5 dimensions you care about. And that's why there seems to be this controversy in the field about games, when in fact there really isn't, when you realize the studies that people care about usually focus on one of those dimensions, not all 5. And they don't look at how the same game can have both positive and negative effects. So that's the framework that I've asked our panelists to at least talk about their work and how it may relate to or extend that. And I'd like to first introduce Dr. Nick Ballou, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute, where he works on pioneering collaborations with game companies like Nintendo and Unity to understand how video games affect mental health, both for better and for worse. He's deeply involved in the open research movement, which seeks to make research on games more trustworthy. Nick, over to you.
Thanks very much for having me and for the introduction. I am going to build very nicely off of what Doug has just presented to you, and I will talk about actually a few more things. I think Doug has laid a nice foundation for 5 different aspects of games that we might think are important in the determination of the mental health impacts of playing games. I think there are actually several more, and crucially, I think that they work together in ways that make it really difficult for us to study. So taking a super high level overview, my take on the kind of state of the art in game psychology research at this point, we have lots of ways that video games can affect mental health, for better and for worse. We've identified something about 13 of those. We're working on a review paper where we try to kind of group the different effects that have been studied over the course of our field's history. The problem is, in many of these cases, the data really are correlational. So we talk a lot about relationships, we talk about prediction and risk factors, but we struggle to make strong predictions about when games will affect players. We struggle to make causal statements about the exact circumstances where games and other features of the player and the environment come together to determine some kind of mental health impact. One thing that I do feel pretty comfortable saying at this point is that in general, the latest research shows that play time is less important than the quality of that play. There are people who play 8-10 hours a day. You look at people like speedrunners or streamers that have really healthy, positive relationships with games and game communities, despite really high playtime. So we tend to look more so at the quality of the play than the quantity per se. So why don't we know more? Why don't I have a stronger kind of take to lead you off with? Because we have lots of these factors that combine to produce effects. It's really difficult to isolate any of these individual things because they work together. So we have the game, we have those things that Doug talked about, and I'll share some similar ones in a second. We have the context in which that game is played, and we have the player themselves and who they are as they go into the game. So going through really quickly, because I don't want to go over time, might consider things like, maybe in addition to or in parallel to Doug's features, you might consider things like the business model. How is the game monetized? What kind of, does it have microtransactions or loot boxes as areas of kind of prominent concern that we might talk about later? We might talk about the genre or the particular game within that genre. We might talk about the mode, whether they're playing in FIFA, the effects of playing something like Ultimate Team, which is kind of this more competitive multiplayer mode with trading card packs, and this randomization element would have very different effects from a solitary career mode play. We might look at particular design elements or features, and of course the contents. When we look at the context in which the game is played, I think looking at how much is an important starting point, but it's not the only thing that's important with regards to time. We might also look at when the play takes place. There was an interesting paper recently that showed that gaming that occurred after school and on weekends was not associated with lower school performance in, I think, an Australian sample. But gaming before school on weekdays was associated with lower school performance. So we might look at when a play occurs rather than just how much of it. And we might look at what the player might have done instead of gaming. During that time, what were the kind of other activities available to them? Were they gaming instead of doing homework? Or were they gaming instead of reading a book or watching a show or other kind of similarly interchangeable activities? We might look at the spatial context, where the play is occurring, what the body is doing, the physical position of the play. And of course, the social context being a huge one, what communities or relationships is the person interacting with or enacting through their gaming. Swiftly along to the last one, kind of broad player factors that also work together with these other things to determine the impacts of games. We might look at play style. What is the person doing? What kind of roles are they adopting in the game? Are they taking a leadership role or a follower role? Are they playing a support role? Things like that. The purpose, the motivations, why they play, what they want to get out of the game when they go into it. The personality and demographics I should include on there as well. Who is the player? What are some of their identity characteristics or traits that might impact how they experience games? And ultimately, this all comes together to produce some kind of emotional effect. How does the play feel as it's happening? And you can give the same game in the same context to different people, and they'll have a different emotional reaction to it. And it may be that emotional reaction that has those downstream consequences that we're interested in. So summing up very quickly, games are really complicated. They're hard to study. We're trying to isolate these things that are kind of inherently interconnected. There are at least 13 ways, probably many more, that games might have mental health impacts. And I have a paper that I can share that we're working on to try to identify these, although we have a long way to go before that's kind of finalized by any means. As a result of these things, lots of impacts, complicated games, it's really difficult to give one size all advice. I think we'll try to do our best on this panel here, but it's really difficult. But on a fundamental level, reflection and transparency about your play can be a really good starting point. And I have some questions that we can ask ourselves, or you can ask your children or other players around you that can maybe help guide them towards healthy gaming. And we'll hear more about that as well, I think. Thanks very much, and I'll pass back to Doug.
Thank you, Dr. Ballou. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kishonna Gray, and she is an associate professor of writing, rhetoric, and digital studies and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. She's the author of Intersectional Tech, Black Users in Digital Gaming, has a book under contract entitled Black Game Studies. Dr. Gray.
Appreciate you. I'm really glad to share space with you all. I'm not going to echo or like repeat everything that folks have said right here, but it's really good advice and really fantastic. One of the things that I love the best about this is it's showing like the range of like methods that we're all like approaching to like study and make sense of these things. And one of the things that I do, I engage in like ethnographic kind of qualitative work, so I have these extended interviews and I do a lot of observations and I kind of watch people and, I engage with like young folks and families. And one of the things that I found myself is thinking about the question that Kris asked, and also with, everybody saying, hey, we probably need to ask like different questions, but games are good and bad, they're both, but what isn't, right? And I think what I spend my time doing, especially with families and parents and guardians, is trying to dismantle the myths associated with like a lot of the gaming. But also in addition to that, I also engage in that intergenerational play with them. So, a lot of times, like in a lot of settings, the young folks are engaged with gaming and then parents or guardians like are in another space. I bring them all together because I find myself realizing that the key and the power, to making sense and understanding games is relationship building. So I know I even have like a gaming with granny event, and so there were some kids in particular. I think Nerf Nana was like the resounding sound because granny actually was pretty good like at the games. But whenever I do like engage with some of the harms, because families do want to know what is happening to my kids in these spaces, I often find myself talking about the harassment campaigns, especially because in the communities that I study and engage in, these are mostly Black and brown communities, a lot of queer and trans communities, so a lot of the parents of these kiddos want to know, like, are my kids safe when they go online? And sometimes I have to say, no, they're not. But this is what you can do to ensure their safety and ensure that they build the capacities to be able to protect themselves. And I think, I've been looking at this work for like a long time, and a lot of the platforms, the streaming platforms, think about Discord and Twitch, YouTube, they have done a great job at like building the capacities for safety, such as removing the comment section, being able to have the power to remove certain comments inside threads, being able to create bots and filters, so we have built the capacities, for safety and protection, but a lot of times we have to piecemeal together, some protection. So there's so many resources, that are out there. So parents and guardians can know how they can equip their kids. And also the things that I do in some of my spaces is activate allies in the space. So for instance, there's like a group of, little young white kids that are like, hey, we don't want our friends to experience racism. How can we be active? How can we do that bystander, kind of engagements, to make sure that we're not just looking silently and watching silently, but that we're active in ensuring that they're protective. And some of the things that I help, because a lot of parents want to know, why are they kids spending so long in those spaces? I have to let them know, I'm like, that's the spaces where they have community. This is where they're safe to be themselves. This is where they're safe to be out. This is where they're safe to be trans. These are where they're safe to do those things inside there. And so I help, parents understand, those how those spaces allow for some certain protection around anonymity. There's also endless like narratives inside the games that they're playing, but that socialization and that community building are really key, especially for our more marginalized and more vulnerable populations, so they can engage. I really appreciate you all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. As you've noticed, this is a slightly different webinar format. We're just doing very brief presentations. Then we're going to have a real discussion among all of our panelists after these very brief presentations. Next up is Dr. Adam Gazzaley. He's the David Dalby Distinguished Professor of Neurology, Physiology, and Psychiatry, and the founder and executive director of Neuroscape at UC San Francisco. Dr. Gazzaley is the co-founder of Achille and Jazz Venture Partners. He's filed multiple patents, notably the invention of the first FDA-approved video game. He's authored over 180 scientific articles and delivered hundreds of invited presentations. He co-authored the 2016 book, The Distracted Mind, Ancient Brains in a High-Tech World. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today. It's great to give a short talk after you already heard some great ones, so I didn't have to repeat everything. And I thought those messages were really critical to question what is the question, and you could see the complexity in trying to answer a simple query of are video games good, because there are all those components that interact and have all the different outcomes that you can imagine with so many different ingredients. I want to go in the opposite direction. I want to actually simplify the concept of video games rather than talk about the complexity. So I would say, from my perspective as a neuroscientist, it's an experience. It's a unique experience, right? It's a digitally delivered interactive experience that has engagement as one of the critical elements of it, but it is an experience. And if you think about it as an experience, it plays by the same rules as other experiences. So we know in neuroscience, a well-founded principle is that our brains have this phenomena, this process called experience-dependent plasticity. And that means that experiences change your brain, and it does so at every level. The structure, the chemistry, the function, physiology, all those aspects of your brain are constantly changing in response to experiences. This is the entire basis of learning. And in that sense, video games are just another type of experience with their own, details, but not in some ways different than education itself as a type of experience with therapy. And therefore, it can be thought of as a tool to change your brain intentionally. Now, it may do it unintentionally, and you heard examples about how playing video games, especially with the factors that Doug outlined, if there's lots of amount of gameplay, and depending on the context and the quality of the content that you're being delivered, it could change your brains in all sorts of, it could change your brain in all sorts of different ways. But what I'm really interested in is how can we intentionally develop, design, and then validate tests carefully, just like we would any other intervention to help people, to see if games can be delivered at a higher level. And this is something that has been of interest to people for many, many years. You're probably, well, the listeners are probably familiar with educational video games and its goal to help improve learning. I've been interested in how video games could essentially be delivered as medicine. And as you heard, we have created the first FDA-approved video game. This is a game that was designed by from scratch to have the elements of it, the mechanics, the interactive aspects of it, the content, the context, all of those features were designed into the game and how it's delivered, and then it's tested to see if it can have a positive outcome. In this case, we show that this video game can improve attention in children and adults, and it's approved by the FDA as a treatment for inattention in young adults, children and adolescents that have ADHD. So from a very high level, video games are experiences. They can have an effect as any experience can, and that effect is going to be influenced by all the factors that you've heard. But what's important to note is that they can also be designed intentionally to have outcomes other than enjoyment or fun, which is certainly an important one. Entertainment is an important part of life, but we're now learning that video games, when designed intentionally, can deliver all these really important outcomes. So I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final panelist is Dr. Alok Kanojia. He's a Harvard-trained psychiatrist specializing in the intersection of technology and mental health, often known as Dr. K. On the internet, Dr. Kanojia is the president and co-founder of Healthy Gamer, a mental health platform that provides content, expert wellness coaching, and community to young people. He's also the author of How to Raise a Healthy Gamer. You heard about this book earlier. Dr. K.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I'm honored to be here with this amazing group of panelists. I'm somewhat familiar with some of their work, and this is just an absolutely stacked panel. So I think what I've been called in to kind of talk about is a little bit about the development of how gaming affects people's brains, what to really sort of focus on in terms of addiction, and then how we can sort of develop healthy gamers. So in my day job, the bulk of my clinical practice was addiction psychiatry. And so I noticed I struggled with video game addiction myself in college and kind of failed out of college and all that good stuff, or bad stuff. And so one of the things that I really struggled with when I was training was trying to figure out, okay, like what are video games doing to people? And I trained back in between 2010 and 2018. And so I think things were not quite as prevalent back then. And so here's sort of what I've learned, and it's really nice to hear so many of my fellow panelists actually corroborating what I've learned, because I'm never sure if I'm actually right or if other people are finding different things. But what we sort of know, there are a couple of key features that we kind of look at. So everyone's well familiar with dopamine, right? So we know that video games release dopamine, but there are a couple of other effects that we see are really problematic. So the first is that they change our attention span. So if you look at sort of what a video game does, a video game doesn't require you to stay engaged. The whole point is that, unlike something like a book where you have to force yourself to pay attention, video game developers are competing to try to keep people as engaged as possible. And so what we tend to see, we're seeing a rise in the rates of ADHD diagnosis, which is why some of these things like Achille have become increasingly important. And so as ADHD is going up, as the rates of diagnosis are going up, as our attention spans shrink, we're starting to see this kind of as a result of gaming, because people don't have to focus their attention. The second thing that we tend to see a lot of, in addition to the dopaminergic stuff, is actually emotional circuitry. So if we look at video games, we know that playing a video game, much like many other addictive substances or behaviors, suppress our amygdala and our limbic system. So these are the parts of our brain that experience negative emotions. And so what we kind of see with unhealthy gaming is a cycle of, let's say I'm being bullied at school, let's say I'm not doing great in my classes. So how do I manage those negative emotions? I'm going to shut them off through video gaming. And then this creates a vicious cycle, because if we really look at the evolutionary purpose of negative emotions are powerful motivators for corrective behavior. So if I feel, afraid of a snake, that fear is there to help me stay alive. And in the case of a lot of these corrective behaviors, if I feel ashamed of, let's say, my appearance or my performance in school, the purpose that we feel that shame for is to study harder, is to work harder, is to maybe go to the gym or something like that. But once we remove that negative emotional circuitry, we remove the corrective behaviors. We also see another interesting aspect, which is a growth in alexithymia. So alexithymia is the inability to detect your internal emotional state. And so what we see in a lot of unhealthy gamers is that they're not even aware of what they're feeling. And what we see is that a lot of parents are kind of stuck on the front lines, or teachers are stuck on the front lines of children and adolescents and even young adults who have this emotional turmoil going on. We see the tantrums, we see the manifestations in terms of depression or anxiety, but the gamers themselves are not aware of what they're feeling, and they can't take corrective action. So what we sort of tend to see is these three neuroscience effects of shortened attention span, suppression of our negative emotional circuitry, and even some degree of alexithymia creates all kinds of problems. And in a clinical setting, what we really look for, how do you know if someone has a problem or not? What we really look for clinically is impairment of function. So whether you're talking about a substance use disorder or a behavioral addiction like pornography addiction, video game addiction, shopping addiction, sex addiction, what we're really looking for is some kind of impairment. So is the behavior interfering with our ability to do schoolwork? Is it interfering with our professional lives? Is it interfering with our physical health? Is it interfering with our mental health? Is it interfering with our relationships? And if it's impacting those in a very impairing way, that's when we really know that we're dealing with an addiction. The last thing to kind of consider is our approach at Healthy Gamer is to help people become healthy gamers. So if you look at a lot of the world of addiction psychiatry, sobriety is the goal, right? So if we're talking about someone who's an alcoholic or uses opiates, the goal is sobriety. But I think when we're looking at these technologies, this is sort of different, right? These are closer to behavioral addictions, where when I'm working with a patient with let's say, sex addiction, the goal isn't celibacy or abstinence for the rest of your life. It's a way to form a healthy relationship with it. And so this is kind of the bulk of where our work is. We worked with, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of gamers. And now we've worked with many of their parents. And what we've sort of found is that the core problem that we see is that as a parent, you're trying to restrict this game, and then your child is fighting against you. The main thing, the one lesson I've learned as an addiction psychiatrist is that, or practicing addiction psychiatry, is that you can't force sobriety on someone else. So our whole approach is helping parents connect with their child, for the both of you to get on the same team. And we use evidence-based methodologies like stages of change and motivational interviewing, sort of really forming that alliance so that both of y'all are working together. Certain communication techniques which parents didn't need, let's say 30 or 40 years ago, because of the way that technology is even shaping our ability to communicate. So as people become more DM-oriented, text-oriented, we're starting to see atrophy of some of these parts of our brain that really pay attention to things like tone and body language. So parents are need to learn a new communication style, get on the same page, and then finally we sort of teach a lot around healthy boundary setting. And the real paradox here is that a lot of parents will really like do things that they think is good, which is actually making the problem worse. And so what we've sort of found is that we've been pretty effective at helping gamers. And then now we've been pretty effective at helping parents. And that's kind of our approach, is get on the same page, learn how to communicate for this new generation. And then lastly, how to set effective boundaries.
Thank you so much. So I'd believe we now can have all the panelists' cameras on. And I guess I'd like to start and open up the question. Most of my work, for example, and a lot of the work out in the field focuses on game characteristics. Most of you, however, also mentioned characteristics of the gamer. And I think this is, and other intersectional aspects of this, community and family. So I know we're not going to be able to unpack all of that here today, but how do we focus on individual differences? How much do individual differences matter? It might be the case that a particular game is healthy for one player, but not for another. How can we know? And how should we be focusing both our research and the way we talk to the public and professionals about this so that they can understand these nuances?
Yeah, I wasn't sure of the order in which we needed to respond, but I'll just jump in here first because I guess I want to highlight what if we don't do that, then what will we continue to get? So a lot of times, a lot of companies, a lot of like approaches want to create like a universal kind of like experience, but we have to unpack and dissect what that universal experience looks like. Usually they have an imagined audience in mind. They have a target demographic in mind. And usually those experiences are very ableist because they don't like take into account like neurodivergence. And so they don't account for those kinds of issues, but they also don't account for, other cultural like differences. So a lot of in my work and a lot of the scholars that are especially like in the Black digital culture space recognize that a lot of these approaches, value Western thinking, white thinking, Eurocentric kind of thinking, masculine thinking, and they don't really incorporate like these other kinds of approaches. So I don't think we need to go all the way extreme and think about like individual approaches, but we need to think, more holistically about how these might impact different cultures and what these engagements might do if we don't start thinking like in more like kind of like holistic intersectional kinds of ways.
Maybe I'll I'll just add one point there. In addition to big differences in populations, there's all the individual differences, even of people within a population, and we see that in our research. Is the most obvious finding of looking at almost any data set is the heterogeneity of it, right? And as scientists, we're always like, is the heterogeneity limited enough that we could find significant differences? But it's always there. There's never, everyone's affected in the same way. So you could see that with games that are designed to do good, like the cognitive games that we create, or games that are designed just as entertainment tools. You could also see just an incredible amount of variability. And I think it's an important, really important point. It's a hard one to study because the intersection between all the differences that an individual could have going into a game, from their own mental makeup to the environment that they're in, combined with all those different factors in games, creates a multi-dimensional problem that is really hard to tease apart in research. But when from a personal perspective of a parent making a decision, obviously you should be thinking about the type of game, how much of the game, all the features that Doug outlined really nicely, but also who your child is and how they interact with these. And then it's also, not only is it not a one size fits all, it's not um, something that is static. It could be a dynamic process where your child changes over time. I have two little kids right now, so this is very, very personal for me. And you know, what happens on Monday of this week is different from Monday of next week. And so you gotta, you know, stay flexible and dynamic and observe. I'd add that my last point is, yes, you know, critical, empirical, controlled research is great, but in a lot of ways, we don't have all the answers, and we may never have all the answers. It's so complex. So some of it is an N of one study that a parent is doing with their child, and it's going to take careful observation. And so being an observer and sort of a scientist in your own right and watching the effects and observing them as opposed to just passing them along, I think is really critical to help understand the individual differences, particularly those of your child and how it interacts with the video games.
I'll just add one last point on that, is that there are some of these things are kind of stable. We have things like LGBTQ identity and neurodiversity that are kind of stable. Country of origin is a big one that the research literature essentially has very rarely addresses. We mostly study Western populations. But there are other things that are not stable. They change over time. I can give it a personal example. There are times that I pick up a game purely because doing work is hard or doing chores is frustrating, and I want to avoid those things. And I might pick up the same game the next day because I want to feel a sense of connection to the characters in that story. So my motivation going into that game is varying day to day. Those individual differences at the trait level are kind of stable, but the effect that that game is going to have on me in those two circumstances is very different. So it's even another layer of complexity that on top of that, it's how people are changing over the course of their day and what they want out of those games when they're playing them.
If I can just kind of chime in. So I want to just support what my fellow panelists are saying. So in my experience, I think, you know, the key challenge that we sort of face is, what are these universal aspects that apply? What is our universal approach, and how do we individualize that? And I think what we've sort of found is that, just like Dr. Gray was kind of saying, and Dr. Gazzaley have been saying, is that there are individual differences. And so if you look at, for example, the University of Toronto, I think they have some really fascinating research on personality types in video gaming. And we've also seen that if you look at, you know, for example, women who get addicted to video games are more likely to be interested in the community aspect. Men who get addicted are more likely to be interested in the competitive aspect. People on the autism spectrum who play specifically massively multiplayer online RPGs and World of Warcraft are more likely to have behavioral meltdowns and tantrums. There's a lot of individuality. So I think that the approach that we need to take is, or this is the approach that we've decided to take, is to really try to equip parents, for example, with a set of skills so that you can individually work with your kid. So these are like core of like communication skills, understanding the core neuroscience, understanding the core psychology, and then tailoring it. I love this phrase of N of one, right? So tailoring things specifically, taking this general information and adapting it to your particular circumstance. And that's when we see by far the best outcomes. Instead of telling all the parents, you should do this, it's we're going to equip you with a set of skills so that you can modify things to your specific household, whether it's an intact household or a divorced household. There are so many different variables, and it's really about equipping people with the tools to solve their individual situation.
Great. Thank you all. You know, we're getting some questions in the Q&A about boundary setting. And given that, you know, you've all in one way or another referenced, you know, this is about trying to find healthy gaming rather than saying games are good or bad. What's your advice for boundary setting? You know, several years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics used to have guidelines for parents saying no screens up until basically age 3, 1 hour a day of entertainment screens for elementary school age children, no more than 2 hours of entertainment screens. So if they're on the screen for school, that's fair, you know, that's free. But for secondary school age, and political pressure kind of made them back off of those numbers. I still think they're good numbers, honestly, and there are data out there that support those as numbers. But I guess I'm interested, you know, what would you say is how are parents best able to set boundaries that really help their children achieve healthy gaming? Dr. Kanojia?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think it's a great question. So what we really try to do is we try to emphasize restraint over restriction. And so our approach is, as a parent, like, what's the job of a parent? The job of a parent is to prepare your child for the world that they're going to live in. And so what this means is that as your child gets older and older and older, they will have free access to technology. So our approach is really about, the boundaries that you set should be aligned towards accomplishing the goals that are important to the child and important to you. So what we sort of start with is by recommending that parents speak to their child about, why do you want to play this game? What is it that's enjoyable to you about it? What do you like about what's challenging in the real world? What do you like in the real world? And to find some kind of common ground. Once you find that common ground, then you can set boundaries kind of around that. And even as a parent, you can say, okay, I get that you want to play with your friends. I get that everyone is playing Fortnite. That's totally fine. I want to support that. At the same time, it is my job and responsibility as a parent to make sure that you go to bed on or get sufficient rest, take care of the things that you need to do. And how can we work together so that you can have fun and we can get these kinds of things sorted out that need to be sorted out, like school or physical health or whatever. And we sort of find that that's a really good place to start. And then, like, two other tips that we found are very, very effective based on our internal research is, the first is that parents are way too ambitious. So parents think about the goal where they want to go, which is like, so if I was this way when I was failing out of college. I literally got, like a 1.4 GPA my first year. And what did I want next year? A 4.0, right? I have to fix the problem. But it is completely unreasonable let's just focus on passing. So parents are so terrified that every month that goes by, every year that goes by, my child is falling further and further behind, which causes them to be overly ambitious. So what we recommend is the 25% rule, which is take where you want to go, take where you are, find the halfway point, and then find the halfway point between the halfway point and where you are, and start small and start winning together. And then once you have victories, then you can start to become more ambitious over time. Because dealing with something like an addiction is, the time scale is very long. And so we strongly, strongly recommend starting small and going for wins.
So just to add one quick one that I found really practical and useful. I don't have children myself yet, but my boss does. He has a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And they are now old enough to reflect on their media use. Of course, children that are very young, that's going to be difficult. But once they're kind of 5, 6, 7 and beyond, and able to think about what they find enjoyable or what they want to do when they pick up a game or another piece of technology, he now has them. He essentially sets no restrictions. He says, you can play games as much as you want, as long as you get the other important things in your life done. So go to school, do your homework, do your chores, get enough sleep, etc. He thinks that usually ends up to be about an hour or two a day that they have left over that they could use for games or other things. When they pick up the game, they have a little diary and they have to fill in the start time, the end time, what they played, I think one thing they like about it, one thing they didn't like about it, and what they would have done if they hadn't played a game. So apparently his daughter always says if she hadn't played a game, she would have watched The Simpsons. And this is kind of really, I find this to be a really interesting and useful way to train your children to be reflective about their media use, train that kind of self-awareness about what they want out of it, whether they're actually getting that out of it, and whether they're maybe straying into a realm where it might become problematic, and can help you have some data for your N of 1 study to monitor that as well.
Thank you. Dr. Gazzaley?
Yeah, I agree with what has been said. Just like one small point, sometimes I try to demystify video games and not make them seem so, unique compared to other types of experiences. And as even I explained to my 3-year-old, like everything we do has restrictions and limitations. Even the things we think are great, like eating and being at school and exercising, and that's just the way life is. You need to put constraints around the good things as well as certainly the bad things, and then have a structure to your day that makes sense. So I do try to not keep giving it like this special space, because then it winds up becoming more of an issue than maybe it should be. It's just yet another thing we need to make a decision about how much you engage in, just like how much you engage in playing outside with your friends is not unlimited. And then, at least from this is not based on research, this is my own personal experience with my 3-year-old. I find I do have started exposing her to some educational games that, fall in the category learning math and reading. And for me, I only let her do it when I do it with her. And that places a burden on me, which is so now we're both in this together, and I have to find the time in the morning to sit down and do it with her. But it has been incredibly positive. I built therapeutic, video games, not these type of games, but it's been really a bonding experience for us to learn how to do them together, and I found that very, very helpful. And she doesn't even usually want to do them without me anymore. It's just something that we do together. So I did create a burden for myself, but that also does restrict the time because I don't have all that much time. So anyway, a personal anecdote.
Thank you. Dr. Gray?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that some of the successes that I found, like in the work that I do, is to have like parents and the children, or guardians and the children, like kind of like enter into this compromise negotiation space where the kids are a part of like how much they might engage and when they might engage. And then so they come to the table saying, the young folks, identify what their needs are. Their needs are mostly wants. They just want to play the game. They want to engage in their friends. And then the parents are like, well, this is what I want and what I need. And so they kind of like come up with like an approach, like a compromise that works. And then students feel empowered. The parents feel like that they also still like have a say. But I think that kind of like diminishes and dismantles like some of the tensions of like parents always feeling like they're having to tell their kids what to do. And this also helps the young folks like develop the decision-making process to make better decisions like for themselves as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to, unpack some of the themes that came across your different answers here. In the literature, there are 4 main ways parents can monitor their children's media. One is co-viewing or co-playing. So you sit and watch with them or play with them. The second is setting limits on how much time they're allowed to play. The third is setting limits on the content. So using the ratings and choosing, say, educational games over violent games or things like that. And the fourth is what's called active mediation in the literature, if you're keeping track on your lucky psychological jargon scorecards. And what you've heard mostly here is people talking about active mediation, where you have a discussion with your child about why they like what they like, why they don't like what they don't like, why you want them to see certain things or not other things, whose point of view is being shown, whose point of view isn't being shown, what effects could playing this type of game have on people, what effects do you notice on yourself, getting them to reflect critically on the media. The literature is very clear. That is the absolute best for kids. That is a powerful protective factor for children. Most parents don't know how to do it, though, because they haven't been trained in critical media studies. They haven't been trained how to watch the media that way and ask those questions. Usually when parents say anything, they usually just give their opinion. I like this or I don't like that. That's very low quality active mediation. So the best active mediation is done with questions. But what about if a parent doesn't know how to do that, doesn't feel comfortable doing that? What is the effect of, say, just setting limits on amount and content? I'll show you probably the favorite study I've ever done in my life. We had 1,400 families of 3rd through 5th graders, and we followed them across the school year. And we talked to the parents, we talked to the teachers, we talked to the school nurses, we talked to the children. We got a lot of data about these families. And if parents set limits on amount and content of screen media at the beginning of the school year, you saw some immediate effects that, yes, those kids were consuming less total screen time, and they were also exposed to less violent media. When we followed these same children out to the end of the school year, those whose parents had set limits on amount and content at the beginning of the school year, they were getting better sleep, which in turn related to lower weight gain, so lower risk for obesity. They were getting better grades in school. They were more pro-social in their behaviors as rated by teachers, which is kind of remarkable because the teachers don't know what family rules for media are at home, but they can see the effect, they can see the behaviors in the classroom, and they were less aggressive, again, as rated by teachers. Now, the two things that fascinate me about this are, first of all, those aren't the same type of outcome variable. You've got physical health, school performance, and social wellness. Those three different types of outcome variables don't usually co-occur, but this one simple thing of setting limits on amount and content of screen media influences all of them. So it is a protective factor that extends out wide, both in time and across a wide range of health and wellness indicators. The more interesting thing to me, though, is no parent will ever know they're having this effect, because you're not going to know that your child gained less weight than he would have, or is getting better grades than she would have, or is more pro-social than he would have been. You only know what your child is. So what parents can see for themselves is the fight over the rules, but they can't see the effect that having those rules is having. And data like this show that these, it's worth having rules, and it's worth holding them firm, because it has a powerful protective factor effect. So the best, of course, is if you can get into this habit of having these discussions with your child. But even if you don't do that, just setting limits does seem to be a very powerful protective factor for children's health and wellness. It's come up a couple times in things you've said, and there's certainly some questions in the Q&A about neurodivergence. What about people who are on the autism spectrum, ADHD? Are the effects similar, different? Should we be handling them differently? Do they have fewer protective factors because, say, they're on the spectrum, and so we have to be a little more vigilant? What are your thoughts about this aspect? And Dr. Kanojia, you've had your hand up for a while. I wasn't sure if you wanted to say something else, or if you.
Sorry, I think I'm happy to talk about it. It's a huge part, but I didn't put my hand down earlier, so apologies, y'all. So yeah, but it's a huge part of our community. So we have a very large neurodiverse community, ADHD and autism spectrum. We work with a lot of parents who are struggling in this way. One of the things that we sort of discovered is that, like a fourth of the book, for example, is about specific diagnoses and how those impact gaming specifically. So I think a couple of things to keep in mind. The first is, if we look at something like ADHD or autism, so gaming is like a double-edged sword. So if we look at someone who's on the autism spectrum, oftentimes they struggle to form connections because due to their neurodiversity, they're not as good at reading tone. They really enjoy highly structured environments. There's almost like the rules of socialization are sometimes difficult for children on the autism spectrum. And that's what's so great about gaming, is that all the rules are laid out, the teams get set, you don't have to worry about body language and tone. You can communicate via, typing out messages. So in some ways, these are very protective. And at the same time, they can also be very, very damaging, actually. So we know, I talked earlier about, there are some studies that show that playing certain kinds of video games will worsen things like behavioral tantrums, outbursts. And we kind of see the same thing with ADHD, where on the one hand, it's really, really nice because these are kids in my clinical experience who they go to school, right? And the teacher tells them, like, just pay attention. Or teacher tells them, like, if you worked harder, you would live up to your potential. And so these children, it's really fascinating if you look at the research, if you look at a comorbid population. So if we look at people who have ADHD and depression, 3% of children who get depression will develop ADHD later in life. 70% of children who develop ADHD can develop depression later in life, if you're looking at a comorbid population. So having ADHD early in life is a very strong risk factor for developing depression. And why is this? It's because these kids recognize that I'm just as smart as everyone else, but I cannot function the way that they do. In a neurotypical schooling environment, I cannot excel the way that I believe I should. And then enter something like gaming, where now you can compete, right? Because now your brain is sort of wired into this game. You select the games that you can kind of focus and pay attention to. So kids with ADHD are very, very drawn into gaming, and it can sort of lead to negative impacts. And at the same time, it can be such a strong source of enjoyment and fulfillment. I also work with esports professionals and streamers of whom have 5 or 6 times the likelihood of the general population of having ADHD. But in a streaming environment, in a pro gaming environment, these are actually can be adaptive advantages. And so it's really a double-edged sword. And I think people just need to treat whether it's a child or adolescent or young adult, you really have to take an individual approach.
I wanted to just highlight, just a few services. Now, I'm not sure if when I put the information in this chat here, if it gets to the rest of the group, but if that could be shared to them, because I wanted to just speak a little bit to like the services like for physical disabilities. I think that's one of the things that we talk about less like inside these spaces. But I know there are a lot of groups like Matthew Iskay, he directs the Unified Esports League that actually, focuses on like how do we get more physically disabled like youth inside like the gaming space. And also Steven Spohn, from the Able Gamers group, and also Quad Gods, it's a group of like quadriplegic like folks who are thinking about like accessible technologies and how the technology of the space like keeps them out and what they have to do, to basically participate and engage. Because I know like a lot of like parents of like, physically disabled like youth, think that their young folks, can't participate and engage, but there are resources out there. So I just want to make sure that folks in the space know about those resources too.
Thank you for those answers. There are several questions about, say, this comorbid aspect. For example, does depression lead to gaming disorder or addiction, or vice versa? And it's a really complicated question to try to answer. You need longitudinal studies with really large populations. There are a couple of these. It does seem that gaming tends to lead the depression, gaming before the depression in most of those studies. But I think truly they're comorbid in that, and we know this about mental health, when you get one disorder, you often get others and they push each other around. So saying, this is the primary one and this is the secondary one doesn't, to me, make a whole lot of sense, honestly, because a therapist has to treat the whole patient. And if all they did is treat, well, what was the first problem you had? The patient's not really going to get better, at least not nearly as quickly as if they treated the whole set of comorbid issues. But how do you guys like to talk about this issue of comorbidity? Because I think it is one that is holding back the public's ability to accept, gaming addiction as a real problem, because they say, well, it's it's just a symptom of the depression. But as long as we keep thinking about this as there has to be a first one and a second one, as long as we think of this as there has to be one core issue, rather than understanding that's not really how the brain works in a lot of circumstances. I think it's a way of kind of keeping us from really confronting some of the issues of gaming that are important in their own right, even if they are comorbid. But what are your thoughts?
I don't want to take up space because I'm not a clinician. I'm not in like the therapeutic space, so I don't want to take up space, but I do want to let folks, especially who are providing services to young folks and like families in the space, I think the model that we have to have is incorporate some of these folks who provide these services into what we do. So, like I mentioned earlier that I do a lot of work like with families. I have therapists like on staff. I have a social worker there because I think we have to like approach a lot of these things like kind of holistically. And so a lot of the families that I serve are under-resourced, they're underfunded. There are a lot of like, they're socioeconomically like disadvantaged. And so there are a lot of, like you said, there are some comorbid things kind of happening. And I'm just a professor studying games, so I don't want to like, assume that I know anything about the space, but I do know that folks have needs that need to be fulfilled, right? So I'm thinking about like, food insecurities, mental health, challenges that aren't addressed, stigmas related to like mental health, especially, in the Black and brown community. It's a lot of like stigmas and, pressures to like not even go and be treated and be seen. I know there are a lot of families that said that was stuff that white people did. And so we have to like dismantle like a lot of those things. And I want to make sure that families get the resources that they need and be culturally sensitive to also those challenges to make sure that they get served and the youth get served as well. So for folks who are like building out these like capacities, make sure that if you're working with families and teams, make sure you have folks that are there that can address like their needs, as opposed to just being extractive and researching them and studying them and then taking stuff from their community and not giving anything back.
I'll also just make a quick comment because I'm not a clinician either. But I can imagine two different classes of players for whom some kind of have depressive symptoms or an underlying mental health condition, and gaming is a symptom that emerges from that. And even if you treat the gaming, that underlying problem will still exist. That is something that I think happens for a lot of players. And I can imagine the opposite, where players who don't really have a lot of problems find themselves sucked into a pattern of gaming that kind of gets out of control, that they struggle to regulate, that leads to problems in other areas of their life. And even if you solve those other problems, that underlying dysregulated or problematic gaming is still there. So I think there are feedback loops that are going kind of in both directions, with each either starting node being possible. And we might be able to think about ways of identifying one versus the other. I would imagine, for example, a player who is kind of treating an underlying mental health condition with their gaming might report, for example, that gaming is an escape for them, a place where they can escape from the problems and stresses of day-to-day life, more so than someone for whom gaming is causing problems elsewhere in their life, who might report something like wanting to reach high levels of achievement in the game, be the best, compete with their friends, things like that. So we might look at the motivations as one way of differentiating where the problem has begun and which problems are kind of following on from that.
Dr. Gazzaley?
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that, this is the most complex of all questions in some ways, because it's sort of going back to something we talked about earlier. You have this intersection between someone's own cognitive and mental health makeup at the time, the environment that they're in, and then it collides with these complicated experiences. And I'm going to generalize beyond video games. I mean, we could be having a very similar discussion with social media use, right? And these are going on, in parallel, that, you have this intersection between where a child or anyone is at that moment and what they are exposed to. So the environment is incredibly influential on these factors, but it doesn't happen in a bubble or as an island. It happens in the context of what that person current makeup is, or their current level of mental health, or the environment they're in, or the support that they have. And it could be removed from video games. It could be their school environment is not supporting them in a way that is helping and is worsening. It doesn't have to be about video games. And so, the long story short is that it's very hard, I think, to have universal conclusions about these things, and that is where health professionals working with the child, adolescent, or adult that is struggling either with addiction or the intersection of their depression and anxiety and whatever experience they're engaging in at a high intensity for a long period of time, like video games or something else, has to just be disentangled in a very personal way. So I always, maybe being a healthcare professional myself, I'm always, thinking about the fact that there is great value to population research, but there's also, going back to that N of one, where really thoughtful time between someone that has a lot of experience in dealing with these situations and the individual that's suffering is going to be necessary to disentangle the situation and to help that person as much as possible.
Yeah, let me pull out one theme a little bit, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kanojia to kind of wrap up this question. A lot of, and I think it's very typical motivation, it's how we use media. We use media as a coping strategy, as a way of de-stressing or whatever. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I think as long as we're not recognizing that games or social media or technology can have problems, that isn't necessarily a good thing. So, for example, here at my university, Iowa State, we get lots of first-year freshmen in. They're in a dorm with a bunch of other boys who also like to play games, and so they stay up really late playing. And then they're tired in class, so they don't do as well on the test. So to deal with the stress of not doing so well, they play more games. And then they are so tired they don't even bother to go to class, and they start failing, to which their response is to play more games. If they bother to go down to student counseling services, they walk in, they say, I'm worried about my grades. The therapist very appropriately asks grade relevant questions. Tell me about how you take notes. Tell me about your study habits. The therapist doesn't ask about games because the patient didn't present with a problem about games. The patient never talks about games because to him, they're part of the solution. And so no one asks about the actual issue, and these students just flunk out. And this is why, for me, this is such a big deal to let's get people at least knowing this can be a real problem on its own, separate from your stresses or your depression or other things, because if we don't even ask about it, we may miss a really important piece of the puzzle. Dr. Kanojia, we'll let you wrap up this discussion.
Thank you so much. So I think, some of my colleagues mentioned, they're primarily researchers. Well, I'm primarily a clinician. I'm not nearly as accomplished in research as any of y'all. So the bulk of my work is working with people. And so I think, what I find is that if we look at addiction psychiatry, there's this concept of dual diagnosis. And what that sort of means is, let's take an analogy of alcohol. So alcohol is something that suppresses our emotions in the moment and leads to low mood over time. So when we have someone who suffers from depression and alcoholism, what we find is they feel depressed, they feel even suicidal. They will drink alcohol to numb themselves in that way. And so just like Dr. Gentile mentioned, they'll kind of use this as an antidote, but then this worsens the problem. And it's hilarious that the example you used was literally my life. I mean, I failed out of college because I was skipping classes. And as the thought of the failure became overwhelming, I would spend 14, 16, 18 hours a day playing games. And that was like literally my first year of college. And we also hear this really sad story of someone comes in, sees a psychopharmacologist, a psychiatrist, for a 45-minute intake. They meet criteria for major depressive disorder. The psychiatrist never asks about gaming. They get prescribed an SSRI, they get sent home, come back and see me in a month. They pop their pill every day, but the gaming is not addressed. So I think the way that I kind of see it is I think it's in some ways simple, because we know clinically kind of what the right answer is that you have to deal with both of these things at the same time. So you have someone who, let's say, has depression, and just like my colleagues have mentioned, this creates negative feelings, and now we have a substance. So in order for anything to be addictive, it needs to do two things. It needs to give pleasure and take away pain. And so what we see in gaming is that this is just a new form of doing that. And as we give some pleasure to someone who's depressed, it feels like almost self-medicating. We remove their pain temporarily, but what the gaming really does is does not fix their circumstances, doesn't give them things to be proud about. And so then this creates a vicious cycle that then feeds the depression. So I'm kind of the mind, and from a clinical perspective, it sort of doesn't matter to me which came first. I think from a clinical perspective, it's that both of these need to be addressed, and we need to understand how gaming amplifies the negative effects of depression and how depression amplifies the negative effects of gaming, and sort of tackle both of those.
Great. Thank you very much. So we've got some questions about brain development, plasticity, perhaps if there are developmental periods we should be mostly concerned about. But I want to frame this question a little broader than that. One of the things I've noticed when I try to talk to people about what the research on game effects is that people like some of the research and don't like some of the other research, and they want to argue that. So they will they'll say, oh, look, educational games are so good for children, but there's no way violent games could have any effect. But all games are educational, right? Anything you practice. Your grandmother was a great neuroscientist. She told you practice makes perfect. She was basically right. And most of the effects we're talking about here have a learning component. Even the addiction has a learning component. Dr. Kanojia just showed you where it is too. Is for something to be addictive, it has to give pleasure, so that's positive reinforcement, and take away pain, that's negative reinforcement. And those two things are just part of how the brain learns. So anything we do, we're going to learn from. are there certain aspects we should be more concerned about than others? Are there certain developmental periods we should be more concerned about than others? Let me ask Dr. Gazzaley to start this off.
Yeah, this is sort of a full circle for me. It's sort of how I began my comments in that, games are experiences, and that is, a core aspect of thinking about them from my perspective, and that experiences drive learning, and they are a powerful driving force of our brain's plasticity. They are heightened during developmental stages, but they persist throughout life. So and experiences have been used as ways of improving brain function for thousands of years, like meditation and mindfulness practices. Therapy is a form of experience as a treatment, and video games can be therapeutic when applied intentionally and designed and tested and monitored, but they don't have any, I would say, directionality on their own or any morality, right? They're like all tools. They cut both ways, right? I always say fire can cook your dinner or burn your house down, and even a molecule can be used as and be viewed as medicine or as poison in the wrong doses or applied wrong. So I like to think of video games as experiences, and when putting it in the context of ways of helping you, then it is a tool like all others. And tools have to be used intentionally, and they have to be monitored because they cut both ways. And so, all of it is thinking about, if you're talking about a video game during childhood, then you have to recognize the fact that experiences drive plasticity, and plasticity is heightened in childhood, and all experiences are going to have large effects, and that the effects of the games are going to depend upon the features that you presented, Doug, right? What are the mechanics? What is the content? How long are you doing it? What are your intentions about doing it? And the structure of it. So, I think that it's really where we started this conversation from, is thinking about video games as a type of experience, a very particular type of experience, a powerful one because it's engaging and it's accessible, and it's fun. Those make for very powerful experiences, but it is like all others in that it will have an impact, especially during childhood, and it will depend upon both the composition of that individual at that time, their environment, and then the factors of those games. So that's why, I think we always struggle, and this field struggles. There is no simple answer to this question, but thinking about these as another experience and another potential tool, it doesn't mean that all games have to have these type of positive outcomes. There's certainly nothing wrong with entertainment and game and fun and play, but it is an important conversation to have when thinking about children and the limited amount of time that they have, and all, how busy kids are these days with how many classes and things that are occupying the time. So thinking about games intentionally as tools that promote learning is a really important conversation.
Thank you. A couple of you work with game developers and have done some yourself. We've got a question on for game designers, how do you find that balance between all of these pushes and pulls? I mean, many of the game designers I've met, they use the word addictive as a positive statement, that about a game, which I think they don't actually mean that in any clinical sense. But again, those same features that make you really want to play and enjoy playing, is there a way to balance this out? What are your thoughts?
I could take a first stab. I think it's helpful to think about this in other contexts. We wouldn't really imagine making movies less entertaining, right? We're like, this cast is too strong. There's too much, the plot is too good, the script is great, the costumes are too nice. We should take Game of Thrones or Succession or whatever the prestige drama of the day is off the air. And I think realistically, even if we talk about ways that we might make games less compelling for players, they're very unlikely to ever get actioned by game developers, and regulators are unlikely to enforce that.
Yeah,
I think
I think we have a name for less compelling games. We usually call them educational.
Chocolate covered broccoli. Yeah, so I think, but there are some cases where I think certain features do have we can recognize them by their effect on players being negative. So we take something like the battle pass, which is a new monetization strategy. You buy a subscription for a game for a month or 3 months, something like that, and then the game gives you rewards on a schedule. So the more you play, the more rewards you earn. And if you don't play a sufficient amount of time or log in every day for that period for which you have the subscription, you will lose out on those rewards. So you'll find lots of players describing, I actually don't really want to play this game right now, but I feel like I have to. And the design features that have that effect on players, where people can recognize, I don't really want to be doing this, but I need to anyway, because I have some kind of investment in there, are the ones that we might want to look out for and try to rein in where possible. The majority of ones that make games compelling for 98% of people and maybe problematic for the remaining 2 are probably not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't have so much to add. I agree with all that. I think that game designers are going to want to make their games fun and engaging and sticky, as all designers do, and trying to change that doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I think that there are some mechanics that are very close to what we'd call gambling mechanics, like some reinforcement strategies that are just considered unhealthy, and that's something that we should definitely monitor. But at the end of the day, it's the delivery of these that really has to be monitored, I believe. Like, for example, with our game, we work really hard on making it fun and engaging. I wouldn't say it's the most fun game you've ever played, but given that our primary objective was to improve attention, I think we did fairly well, and we continue to work in that direction. But then we limit gameplay. So how we positioned it to the FDA, and in all of our clinical trials, and how we sell it to children, is that you can only play it 30 minutes a day. You can't play it more than that. The game shuts off. You can't play the game 7 days a week. So you can only play it 5 days a week, and you get it in a month allocation. So we're basically dosing it and monitoring it like as if it was any other type of medicine, that it has a dosage, and you should think about it. Now, maybe that's a little more extreme than you could do with a game that's targeting entertainment. But going back to, something we've been discussing all along, is that certainly as parents, you need to create the structure of where these games fit into the larger life activities that a child's engaged in. And as an adult, you should also be fitting it into that larger structure. We can enforce it through the FDA. But I think that, to answer your question, game designers are going to apply their art and their skills and their craft to make fun, engaging medium, and they should. And then we have to think about the delivery and how we control that.
Great. So I think the last question we'll wind up with here is about what are the warning signs parents should be looking for that the games are perhaps having more harmful effects than a parent would want, which doesn't mean that somehow they've become totally, monolithically negative, right? That's part of, it's not going to be simple, good and bad. Otherwise, we wouldn't need panels like this. This would be simple. But some of the things that I've seen in the literature are issues like if your child's starting to give up activities that they enjoy, so they're quitting sports, they're quitting music, they're quitting after school activities, if their grades are dropping, if they're giving up friends or only seeking friends that also game, if their moods become worse, particularly if they have to stop gaming. These are some of the things that I've heard that parents notice when their children are starting to have a somewhat dysregulated approach to their gaming. But what else should parents be paying attention to? Or is there a place where you say, this is when parents should step in and do something? My answer to that would be they should have stepped in from the beginning. You should never give up the control to what children are spending their time with. And that's not just about games. That's you should be an involved parent. But of course, that's not always possible with parents needing 2 jobs or things like that. So what is it parents should be paying attention to? Dr. Kanojia.
I guess I'll give this a start. But so I know this answer may sound a little bit strange. So we've talked about, and I agree with you 100%, that parents need to be involved from day one. This is not a wait until it's a problem, especially in the world that we live in today. As Dr. Gazzaley mentioned, it's these game companies' job to create as engaging games as possible. And they are competing with each other. And the person who makes the funnest game, the most addictive game, is going to be the one that, you know, your kids are playing. So they're competing against each other to create an addictive game, and your kid is the one who loses. So the first sign that I've sort of learned from my clinical practice is the first sign is actually not anything in your kid, it's something in the parent. So you know your kid. If you think inside, pay attention to your parental instinct, which, you know, has been honed over millions of years of evolution. Pay attention to your instinct. If you think something is wrong, that's the first reason that you should investigate. Second thing to consider is, I think, a change. So I think you sort of alluded to all these, right? So we're looking for a change. So you used to know who your kid was. Your kid grows up, they're 6, they're 7, they're 8, and then something can happen where your child starts to change. They're not hanging out with their friends. They're not quite as engaged in their school. We see that isolation, withdrawal, and sort of an emphasis on gaming and gaming related behavior, which includes streaming and all this kind of stuff too, is really like one of the other warning signs. So I'd say, first of all, trust your instinct. Second of all, if you see any impairment of function. Third of all, you know, a change, just a substantial change to their personality, the way that they're behaving, things like that. And then the last thing is isolation and withdrawal, and sort of overemphasis on the game.
Great, thank you. So we're out of time for dealing with questions. I'd like to ask each of you if you have any specific final thoughts that you'd like to offer, or points from the full discussion that you'd like to really highlight as takeaways. And perhaps let's start with Dr. Gazzaley.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize what I have been all along, that we have to just broaden our scope of thinking about video games, that they are experiences, very special experiences, but they're experiences first and foremost, and that they don't fit an easy category because they have many different elements. Like all you know, experiences like sports, there's a massive genre. Even things that aren't quite experiential, like food, you wouldn't say, oh, is food good or bad for you? And so that's the first takeaway, is just to think really broadly about video games. And hopefully I've been able to add a little flavor around video games when they're intentionally designed and developed to accomplish an outcome and then tested. I mean, it took us 13 years to get from the game idea to FDA approval. These are, if you do it well and rigorous, they're long processes, and that process never ends, constantly studying and testing and evolving. That video games could be more than entertainment, and certainly the entertainment factor is critical, but I'm really excited about what I think is this next era of video games, when we, and that's been happening, embracing them first and foremost, not first and foremost, but also as art forms, that we've recently recognized that these are artistic expressions across all the dimensions of art, and now looking at them as tools to really enhance what makes us human and not diminish us is really, I think, an exciting focus of the next decade. So I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you. Dr. Ballou, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll use my time for 2 things. One, I would love for the science to be able to give us better answers than we've been able to give. We've done a great job, I think, but there are even better answers to be found and given. And one of the reasons that we struggle to do that is because of data access. The games industry is really reluctant to work with independent researchers, and hopefully that's slowly changing. There are some positive signs, but write your local representative, argue where you can for access. That companies should be making technology use data available for researchers, and look for studies where you have an opportunity to do that and participate, because it really helps us out a lot. And the second one is to emphasize, we have talked quite a lot about negative effects. That tends to be where these discussions lead, because we want to prevent the most harmful experiences, the most harmful cases of media use. But really, the majority of people benefits. A lot of people, gaming is essentially neutral, right? They're gaming instead of watching a show, instead of reading a comic book, and fundamentally they're kind of using games in a way that is interchangeable with other activities. So for a lot of people, gaming is really not that impactful at all, and that's fine. For others, they're benefiting really positively. Games are a great way to feel a sense of meaning and appreciation with an emotional connection to characters. They're a great way to relieve stress and be part of a pleasant environment and escape from kind of a less pleasant reality for time to time in moderation. They're ways to satisfy our need to grow and develop and build new skills. Games are a way to learn effectively, like Adam has emphasized, and they do that in a really effective way. So games are good for the majority of people, and I hope that for you and your children that is and remains the case.
Thank you. Dr. Kanojia.
Yeah, so I just want to say I think parenting nowadays is just really hard. So I think so if we think about how we parent, we learn how to parent from our parents. The challenge that I think we face as a generation is that our parents never taught us anything about healthy technology habits. And so parents are placed in this unique situation where I don't think government regulations are sufficient enough. We've heard from Nick and Adam about how, game companies are going to make addictive games. That's what they're going to do. They're going to hide their data. This is a tool, right? And some people are not going to use it for the health of your child. So parents are left in this situation where this stuff has really invaded. I mean, it's like an invasive species that is colonizing our mind. Technology, the first iPhone is, I think, like less than 20 years old or something like that, right? It's crazy how quickly this stuff has invaded our society and squeezed into every nook and cranny. We see problems at schools, we see problems at home. And so parents are like really getting crushed because they're not getting sufficient support. The good news is that thanks to the work of amazing researchers like the people on our panelists, I completely agree with Nick that we need better science, but thankfully these people have been doing science. And that has given us some sense of an answer about how to move forward, right? We do have tools like Achille. We do have tools like we developed a program, and a lot of this stuff is in the book. And, that's based on the research of people like these panelists. And the cool thing that we've been able to see is even though it feels really hard and all your kid talks about is the damn game all the time, it can be so overwhelming as a parent. The good news is that there is a lot that you can do. And the interesting paradoxical thing that we see is that as you work on this problem with your child, over time, we actually see a strengthening of the relationship, right? And I think Dr. Gentile, when he was sort of showing that JAMA article, sort of showed about how when you intervene early with games, you see a cascading effect of benefit for your child. And the challenge with parents, as you beautifully pointed out, is they don't know that, right? All they see is the struggle. They can't see the benefit. So I think even though it can feel really challenging, and it is objectively very challenging, this is a new thing. No one has ever had to parent this generation of kids before, and it's completely new. The good news is that there are a lot of people working really, really hard, and we do see really, really good outcomes. So don't give up hope, and maybe game a little bit with your kid.
Yeah. So thank you for all of your comments. Dr. Gray apologizes she had to leave for another meeting. I'll just sum up by saying, I think it's easy for us to dismiss games as if somehow by calling them a game, it's childish. I think, certainly, Adam, you pointed this out. They've become art. And by art, what I mean by that is great art can change you. It leaves the viewer changed. Well, what is that change? That is an effect of the game on you. So we should take that seriously. We should take the game seriously. We should take the research seriously. And I'll hand it back to Kris Perry.
Thank you all for being here and for this enlightening discussion. As I mentioned, we have copies of Dr. K's book, How to Raise a Healthy Gamer, to give away today. Scan the QR code on the screen, click the link in the chat, or visit the Donate Now section of our website to make a donation of any amount, and you will be entered in to win one of 9 free copies of this great resource. Your donation supports the Institute's free educational programs and resources like this webinar. Find more resources at childrenandscreens.org or follow us on these platforms and subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed. Please join us for our next webinar, Driven to Distraction, Media Use, Attention, and Cognition at noon Eastern on Wednesday, April 10th. Thank you and be well.